Senator from Utah.
I ask unanimous consent to suspend the quorum call and to complete my remarks, notwithstanding the previous order.
Without objection.
Madam President, our founding fathers knew and understood well what it was like to live in a dangerous world. When America was founded, we were threatened by foreign adversaries. The military might of the United States was feeble compared to the great powers of that day. And yet the founders insisted on a Constitution that would protect the civil liberties of the American people. They knew that it was possible to defend the homeland and Americans' rights at the same time. It still is. The War of Independence was fought, in part because King George III abused general warrants that let his officers snoop through the papers and property of law-abiding subjects. The abuse of general warrants and the use of things like writs of assistance prompted the American people into action, representing that their fundamental liberties were at stake. That's part of what ushered in the American Revolution. The Fourth Amendment to the Constitution was put in place specifically to protect these very kinds of liberties and to protect the American people against this very type of snooping. The Fourth Amendment does this by prohibiting unreasonable searches and seizures of Americans' persons and property. The very wording of the Fourth Amendment itself recognizes that this is part of what our security means. It's not just that we're protecting privacy. We're protecting privacy by protecting our security, to make sure that we are secure in our persons, our papers, houses, and effects. The Fourth Amendment also requires search warrants to be limited in scope and to be based on evidence adducing probable cause that a crime has been committed. Those warrants also have to be particularized so that they're not open-ended, so that they can't be applied to any and every circumstance. Now, critics of the Fourth Amendment complain about it. They complain about it from time to time, as if it were somehow an annoyance that has to be dealt with, ultimately circumvented. Some people refer to it even as something of a security threat in and of itself. This is wrong. Our nation's history should itself be enough to convince us that the Fourth Amendment is no annoyance. It's an essential safeguard of our liberty in the face of a vast, powerful, and frequently overreaching government. Just think of how much more powerful the government has become in the age of supercomputers and the internet. The kinds of abuses endured by the founding generation will be repeated on an even greater scale if we're not vigilant in checking the power of government. Last night, this body, the United States Senate, voted to close debate on a bill to reauthorize Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. This program may sound dry, it may sound inconsequential or even uncontroversial to many people's lives, but supporters and critics who are familiar with it often agree that it's anything but. FISA Section 702 authorizes the intelligence community to spy on suspected foreign terrorists. Now, not many people are troubled by that aspiration. The intelligence gathering that this authorizes is a valuable task, and it's one that helps protect the homeland from bona fide threats from outside the United States. However, FISA 702 also allows the collection of incidental intelligence about American citizens who communicate with foreign suspects. Once the intelligence community has collected this incidental information about Americans, domestic law enforcement can access the information for their own investigations without first obtaining a search warrant, as contemplated under our constitutional structure. In other words, FISA 702 opens a back door to government spying on American citizens. This incidental spying is a different matter altogether, and it does implicate the Fourth Amendment. certainly the spirit of the Fourth Amendment, if not also the letter thereof. It's profoundly worrying that the government maintains vast collections of information about American citizens, no matter how that information is collected, incidentally or intentionally. It's likewise worrying that the government cannot or will not specify, list exactly how many Americans have been subjected to government snooping under this provision. Surveillance programs like this one may be implemented with the best of intentions. And I'm willing to assume for purposes of this discussion that they are with the best of intentions here. But they themselves provide the raw material that overzealous bureaucrats can use to snoop on anyone the government doesn't like. You see, when we speak of the United States, when we speak of our government agencies, we're not speaking of an omniscient force, something that can only act for benevolent reasons. Our governments, by necessity, are run by fallible, mortal individuals. No matter how patriotic might be the goals underlying this law or the agencies that implement it, at the end of the day, a human being is in control of each and every action taken under this law. So maybe, you might say, the subjects of this type of government surveillance are, in fact, overwhelmingly threats to the public. But can you guarantee that's the case? And if it's the case today, can you guarantee that it will always be the case? Can you be so sure that tomorrow or the next day or next year or a few years from now or decades from now that that will also be the case? What if the next time the subject is a critic of the government? Or perhaps the subject is a petty political enemy of someone charged with implementing this statute. History cannot reassure us that this or any other surveillance power will always be used for good. It's not difficult, for that matter, to fathom hypothetical scenarios in which this could come about. Imagine, for example, a political candidate disliked by someone with authority to do a so-called backdoor search of a Section 702 database. Imagine that someone with that authority dislikes that political candidate and decides to go looking for dirt on that political candidate, finds dirt on that political candidate, and then decides perhaps to leak that same information unlawfully accessed by this individual acting pursuant to this program. Now, this might be against all sorts of departmental protocols. It might be against the policy of those same agencies charged with administering this statute. But the fact that we can't rule it out, the fact that it's not clear that this couldn't happen, ought to be concerning to every single one of us. The only check on this frightening power is the FISA court, which rules in near total obscurity about what the government is allowed to collect. I say the FISA court is the only check because Congress certainly isn't acting like a credible check on this authority. Not long ago, the House handed us a bill that would reauthorize FISA Section 702 for another 6 years. And I'm sorry to report that many of my colleagues in the Senate are forcing this bill through as is, in the same condition as we received it from the House of Representatives, without a single change from the bill that the House sent us, without any amendments to protect Americans against warrantless backdoor searches by the government about U.S. citizens on U.S. soil. I believe that Americans' Fourth Amendment rights are worth much more due diligence than that. Instead of simply rubber stamping FISA 702 through the bill that the House sent us, this body could have strengthened it by voting against cloture, which would have opened up the bill for amendments. Now, to be clear, a vote against cloture would not have been a vote against FISA Section 702. It would not have ended the program or jeopardized our nation's ability to spy on suspected foreign terrorists. In fact, as far as I know, not one of the members of this body that voted against cloture would even support such an outcome. Not one of us, as far as I'm aware, would like to see FISA end. What we would like to see is for amendments to at least be considered, to be debated, to be discussed by the people's elected representatives in this body, to make sure that we have achieved the proper balance between the power the government desires and the security and privacy of the American people. A vote against cloture would have allowed this body to improve FISA Section 702 through a legitimate amendment process, one that we unfortunately are being denied this week. You see, one of the reasons why it's important that, as we consider this, to allow for amendments is that this law comes up for reauthorization only so often. And I think the American people legitimately would expect that when it comes up, we'd actually have an open, honest debate and discussion, and that we do more than simply rubber stamp what the other chamber has already passed, that we ask some difficult but important questions about the rights of the American people relative to this program. Had we voted down cloture, had we decided not to vote to end debate, this would have given us an opportunity to protect American safety and their constitutional rights. Not one or the other. It wouldn't have put us in this awful Hobson's choice scenario where you've got to choose to protect one or the other. So what, you might ask, might some of these possible changes to Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act have looked like? They would look a lot like the provisions contained in the proposed USA Liberty Act, which Senator Leahy and I introduced last year. The USA Liberty Act would tighten the standard that the government must meet in order to collect and access information on you pursuant to Section 702. This safeguard and any of the other provisions contained in the USA Liberty Act would be worthy additions to FISA 702. These changes would not restore respect for the Fourth Amendment, perhaps overnight. I believe it'll take many more battles with the entrenched interests within government to achieve that. But they would be steps in the right direction. If history is our guide, any unlimited, unaccountable power we hand to the government ultimately will be used against the people. In FISA Section 702, the government has a vast grant of power, a digital age general warrant to hoard untold terabytes of information about American citizens. I hope, Madam President, that we can work together in coming months to improve this surveillance program and vindicate what the founders so clearly knew, that our safety does not have to come at the expense of our rights, that our security and our privacy are not at odds with one another, but that our privacy and our security are one and the same. Our security is part of our privacy and vice versa. We can protect both. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can honor the Constitution and protect the rights of the individual while simultaneously protecting the security of the greatest civilization the world has ever known. We can do better, and we must. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.